Global Marxism online talks. I am Gyeongsang, a researcher of the SSK Research Cluster at Jena. Today, Dr. Bue Rübner Hansen will give a presentation on the topic Ecological Crisis and the Question of Concrete Labor. Dr. Hansen is a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Sociology, University of Jena, and a co-founder of Common Ecologies and a co-editor of Viewpoint magazine. His research interests include political ecology, political economy, social reproduction, and social movement. Among his articles in English, there are the interest of briefing towards a theory of ecological interest formation in crisis and critique, batshit job, no one should have to destroy the planet to make a living in open democracy, and so on. Thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Hansen. You have 1 hour. Yes, you have 1 hour for presentation, and then we will have about 30 minutes for floor discussion. Dr. Hansen, please start.
Thank you so much for this invitation and this wonderful introduction. I'm really excited and honored to speak in this context, and I'm also humbled because I don't know what the debates are in South Korea or more widely in East Asia, so I don't know how whether I overestimate the novelty of my insights. Not that I can claim that much novelty, but I wish I knew better what debates you're engaged in. But I hope you will still find it interesting. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation. I hope that's okay. Do you see my face also?
Yes.
Great. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about the question of concrete labor with the focus on the ecological problematic today. Briefly, and maybe unnecessarily, since that was such a good introduction. This is who I am, and I want to mention one thing, which is that I've started a school called Common Ecologies, which is doing education within social movements, climate movement, labor movement, housing movements, and so on in English. And you're very welcome to check out our website. We have online courses. So I'm trying to use my academic research in a way that is in dialogue with and feeds into social movements, just to understand a little bit where I'm coming from. So the plan for this presentation is first I'm going to raise the question of concrete labor. Then I'm going to go into the specificity of what I call batshit jobs. Then I'll talk a little bit about how we can think about the objective harms of batshit jobs, which I define as jobs that participate in the destruction of ecosystems. And then we'll talk about some of the ways in which people are attached to this kind of work and disaffected as well. So the pandemic and climate change forced us to pose the question, what labor must be suspended to avoid disaster and what labor must continue? In the years to come, the debate about green transition will continue to intensify the question of the abolition or transformation of carbon jobs and the character of work in an ecological transition. And for me, this is very interesting. It's quite novel because the trade union movement has in many years been focused on what we could call the quantitative aspects of work. The length of the working day, the amount of wages, and so on, but has accepted in most countries, at least those that I'm familiar with in Western Europe and North America, has accepted that capital or employers, if it's the state, organize production, take decisions about what concrete labor is carried out. So going back to Marx, he insists, as you're probably, well, surely all familiar, on the distinction between abstract and concrete labor. And here's a quote from Capital Volume 1. Labor must be broken down into its twofold form. On the one hand, into concrete labor in the use values of the commodity, and on the other, into socially necessary labor as calculated in exchange value. So on the one hand, you have the concrete labor, which has to do with qualities, has to do with the division of labor, and which Marx describes as a life task of the worker. On the other hand, you have abstract labor, socially necessary labor, which is described in terms of quantity, as undifferentiated, and as expressed in terms of money. So socialists have often stressed abstract labor, both from the reformist side, like I mentioned, social democrats and trade unionists thinking in abstract quantitative terms about the redistribution of incomes, of the value generated through the capitalist process of valorization between capital and labor, and left all questions about the quality of work itself relatively to the side. But also many communists, like one tradition that I partly come out of, which is value form theory, has insisted a lot on abstract labor, the critique of abstract labor as a form of domination and the needs for its abolition, but without any attention, understandably from within that research paradigm, without any attention to concrete labor, with an idea that that is a question that we better leave for the time after the abolition of wage labor. So even the most radical and the most reformist positions have tended towards a quantitative look on labor, I would argue. So what happens when we shift from abstract to concrete labor? Well, this is clearly nothing new, in the sense that you have, since the beginning of capitalism, since the struggle against proletarianization, you have had artisans making demands for meaningful work, fighting for maintaining their kinds of work which were experienced as meaningful, as pleasurable, in the sense that there was an exertion of skill, there was a satisfaction in seeing the finished product and so on. There was relatively little alienation in the immediate process of production. Also, you've had a focus on concrete labor in workers' own pride in the social value of the work, even when it's alienated. So you say, okay, I'm part of this great division of labor. I don't see. I don't have any overview over the process of production. Nonetheless, I'm proud that I participate in the production of socially necessary things, which has, of course, also been an ideology of the labor movement and of socialist states. Then there are feminists who have focused on forms of labor that are not subject to quantification, unpaid reproductive work specifically, as being necessary because of its very concrete character in reproducing labor power, both generationally and in the everyday life. Finally, there was, let's say, a kind of hype around knowledge work as immaterial work, where there was around 2000, the decades around there, you're usually familiar with this, as a kind of the future of work, the liberation of work through it getting a different concrete character, so-called, and I think this is wrong, but a so-called immaterial labor. So all these different approaches to concrete labor have focused on valorizing, giving value to, so let's say valuing, because valorizing is, maybe pick the wrong word there, but giving value to concrete living labor as either meaningful, necessary, or potentially liberating. This is not what I'm going to talk about today. There's a different approach to concrete labor, and one that I think is much more urgent, which is the question of the ecological impacts of concrete labor. How does concrete labor facilitate the social the metabolism between human and non-human ecologies? And I start with batshit jobs, which are jobs that, on the one hand, do objective harm on the bodies of workers, people who live around, on ecologies, and also jobs that may or may not cause workers to feel shame in what they're doing or disgust with the consequences of this kind of work. So the reason that I chose the notion of batshit jobs was, well, as you know, in the world of ideas, especially if you're trying to have impact outside the academy, it's useful to come up with something that can work a little bit as a meme, something that has resonance. I don't know if I was successful with this, but I wanted to play on someone who definitely was successful in those terms, those agitational terms, which was David Graeber's book on bullshit jobs, which he defined as a form of employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as a part of the conditions of employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case. So, meaningless work. This is something I have experienced with myself, and it's something that is really subjectively draining. Batshit jobs is something else. So, as you may know, batshit is like an American slang term for something that is insane. It's like something is batshit crazy, and the idea of this is that there are certain jobs that are objectively, not subjectively, because it might not drive people mad, but objectively mad in the sense that in order to make a living, you contribute to undermining the conditions of life, right? You have to make a living, but you're undermining the conditions of planetary life. And that is a kind of objective madness. And workers are, in some cases, well, not just planetary life, but it can be your own life. It can be that the job makes you sick. And here's a quote from an ex-coal miner in West Virginia in the United States, who says, and I can't reproduce his dialect, but I'll read it out nonetheless. There's this misconception, especially with the all-in-liberal media, that this 90% of people are just ignorant about climate change, ignorant about the effects of mountaintop removal and all the health effects. Keep in mind, we're the ones getting cancer from the coal mining practices, not y'all, so we can kind of speak to the matter. So, to start with, loosely getting to describe what might be batshit jobs, we can look at different destructive industries. Oil, coal, and gas mining, clearly. Fossil fuel infrastructure construction, which is facilitating the former, the airline industry, industrial agriculture, ocean freight, the auto industry, the construction sector based on concrete and so on. Marketing that promotes an economy, a high consumption economy, and it could also be university education, the people who train petroleum geologists, for instance. Right, so this is just an impressionistic list, but it raises the question: which of these industries have to be abolished, and which can be transformed? Right, I don't have the answer to this, but those are the kinds of questions, not just that we should be asking ourselves, but that are being asked by policymakers in many different countries. It's the courage to act on it, and the radicality with which they make the judgment is insufficient, I think. But it is being discussed. So there's a different, like, can oil mining be transformed? I don't think so. I think that has to be abolished. Can the auto industry be transformed into something else? Maybe, right? and certainly marketing. People can put their energy into something else and producing desires for commodities whose production process is ruinous to the environment. Okay, I think one way to start to define it, and I'm not going to give it develop, let's say, a scientific theory of what is harmful and what is not. Other people are better at that. But to start to get to an ecological perspective, I will start with job that is literally batshit jobs, which is guano mining. Guano is it's droppings, shit from birds, but also from bats, right? So it's literally batshit work. And in the 19th century, capitalist agriculture in North America and Western Europe had exhausted the soils more and more. And this is, we're familiar with the people who read about Marx and ecology. We're familiar with Marx's inspiration from the German chemist Liebig. And that was one of the big issues that were discussed in agriculture at the time. Like, how do we feed societies? How do we feed workers? How do we feed capitalist countries on conditions of soil exhaustion? One of the solutions to that was before the invention of artificial fertilizers, which are largely fossil fuel based on methane gas. They would import vast amounts of guano nitrates, especially from the Peruvian coast, not just from bats, but more centrally from marine birds. And in a fascinating book about this, Gregory Cushman writes, by jumpstarting these revolutionary trends, the exploitation of Peruvian guano nitrates during the guano age played a supremely important role in bringing an end to the ecological old regime, where you would have farmers would be dependent on an almost unsigned nutrient cycle, and the replacement by a new industrial order based on throughput. So for me, this is a necessary ecological definition of what is the work that undermines the conditions of life, that undermines ecosystems. So even if guano is a natural and renewable material, this industry can be batshit when it facilitates the breaking of nutrient cycles and the widening of metabolic rifts, as it did in the 19th century. So it's all well and fine to say this or that industry must be abolished. There's a kind of top-down view, which is what I was mentioning is discussed in some policy circles. But obviously, as Marxists, we have to take the perspective that's from the bottom up, not just from the side of wage workers, but also from the side of unwage workers. Let's see here. Well, so obviously people will defend their livelihoods, right? This is a basic thing. Unions tend to defend jobs over working for transitioning industries towards something that is not ecologically destructive. And this is a story we've been told again and again. But I would like to recuperate another story of the critique of concrete labor by starting with this example from the struggles against pollution in Porto Maguera, which is a big port outside of Venice, Italy. And in the 1970s, the workers there became increasingly suffered under especially byproducts from the chemical industries in that port. And I want to read two poems by the worker poet Ferruccio Brugnano, who lived and worked in this industry and was a part of the struggle there. I drag myself along the factory walls day and night I'm always by these walls. I can't help it. I can't go away. My comrades I have inside there, alone amidst the phosgene, before the horrible stoke holes I just can't detach. My heart is in there, my struggle, burning high, like a torch towards the future. Enough with the emphysemas, with the intoxications, with the systematic, silent destruction. Enough with this atrocious war waged in the factories in the name of humanity, of progress, of love. Enough. Our blood is fed up. So here we have it in the middle of the Fordist, or towards the end of the Fordist era, a worker with many other workers fighting against the ideology of progress, of infinite industrialization, on the basis of its harm on workers' bodies. But not only that, he also writes poetically about finding dead birds and trying to diagnose what chemical they could have died from, based on the dead birds he had found near the production line. Another disaffection that we're seeing now, another kind of disaffection, is the youth movement against climate catastrophe, Fridays for Future, which I think we must see as a workers' movement, not as current workers, but as future workers. And these are future workers who are on strike against them, in order to put pressure on politicians and so on, but also with different levels of assumption of this, but also against an educational system that's training them to participate in an ecologically destructive economy. You see that especially in critiques of the curriculum, in critiques of the fact that there is very little ecology on the educational program. I don't know how it is in Korea, but in most European countries, to my knowledge, there's people are simply not trained in thinking ecologically, and climate education about climate change is relatively superficial. So also there's a tendency towards a refusal of participation in destructive jobs and training for those. When people go on strike, there's an incredible amount of self-education going on. I know that from participation in the climate camp in Vienna, which is, well, it's a blockade of a highway project that's been going on for 7 or 8 months. And there's has been a rich program of self-education, both more formally through workshops, presentations, but also, you know, people learn things that you otherwise don't learn in the struggle, which is how do you organize yourself? How do you organize the logistics of a space-based occupation? How do you bring in people from the cities? How do you do the logistics of water, sanitation, toilets, food, and all these things? There's a lot of like this is an educational space, self-educational space. And also you see young people moving more and more into studying things that will give them what they consider meaningful and useful jobs in the future. Another example of workers' disaffection is the workers of Lucas Aerospace in the UK in the 1970s, who were producing weapons that were exported to contribute to the US war in Vietnam, towards suppression of anti-colonial rebellions, towards Pinochet's Chile and so on. And the workers there said no to arms production. We want socially useful work. And together with different outsiders, workers, many of them were engineers, so they had skilled workers with knowledge about how to transform the assembly line, transform the production. Had different proposals for what they could be doing instead with the machinery, with the production lines that they had. So the overall scheme, which is inspired by something like the struggle of the Lucas aerospace workers, made the so-called Lucas plan, is this idea of just transition, which you might be familiar with. It's this idea that that what we need is not just a transition to a carbon-free economy. We need a just transition in which jobs that are to do with with high carbon intensity jobs in mining, in auto industry, and so on, have to be replaced with equivalent jobs, such that the transition does not result in social injustice, in unemployment, and so on. So the reason I'm talking about this is, because I think we have to be careful by simply thinking just transition is the solution. So here's a quote from climate activist Tasio Müller, who I interviewed, but I think this is from a text actually that he wrote. By all means, let's continue to search for convincing just transition policy proposals, but let's always be clear that these industries need to be shut down rapidly, whether or not such proposals emerge. Anything else would turn just transition into the green economy of the left, creating the illusion that economic growth or the expansion and or maintenance of good industrial jobs in the global north are compatible with stopping runaway climate change. And this is something you've seen in a lot of cases of just transition, which is that trade unions wait for transition to be imposed by someone else, typically by the state, but also by employers adjusting to new policy regimes, so that workers are not actively fighting for transition. They are trying to make transitions that are happening more just, which means that they're fighting against the transition insofar as it is unjust from their perspective, which means that workers, rather than being protagonists in the transition away from fossil fuels, become an actor that makes transition more expensive for capital and the state, which is obviously a paradoxical situation, which is also understandable to some extent. But we have to ask the question of how can workers and trade unions become protagonists in just transition, because transition in itself is just and necessary, rather than wait for states and capital to do the transition for us, which of course is recognized they're doing way too slowly. So let's talk about how people are attached to work. So Ikigai. I don't know. Can anyone tell me about Ikigai? Is that something that people know about in Korea? It's this Japanese concept that's mostly spoken about in self-help books in Europe and North America.
Yeah, this is. I'm Japanese, but this is Japanese, definitely.
Yeah.
Ikigai,
right, yeah.
The meaning for life, or something like that.
Yeah. How do you give meaning to everyday life, to what you do? And this, so would you describe it as a critical philosophy or an ideological philosophy? What role does it play in Japanese society?
Actually, this is more like common word, not academic word. Most usual Japanese can understand what it means. So yeah, it's a bit difficult to describe. This is really common word.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's great. I was asking for a contribution. I'm very happy. The way that it's used in Western self-help books is ideological from my point of view. It's very much about how can you as an individual get meaning in your life, give meaning to your life. It's a term that is that isn't used for social critique or for ecological critique for that matter. But I think it can be used this way. So this is a diagram that's often reproduced. I don't know if in these Western self-help books, I don't know if it's also common in Japan. But it says what gives meaning to your life is if you're able to do what you desire, what the world needs, what you do well, and what you get paid for. And I think this gives us a category of a list of reasons why people might be attached to work. You're attached to work because you need an income, right? And for some people, it's only that, and that makes you miserable. If you don't do your work well, if it's not what the world needs, if you don't desire it, right? Then some people are attached to work because it gives them the pleasure of doing something well, of exerting a skill, of finishing a product. And this is the kind of artisan appreciation of work that also a lot of academics have, of course, where we often operate as with an artisan attachment to our own work. Then you have another layer, which is being attached to your work because it gives you a social role, it gives you respect, recognition. And finally, people can be attached to their work, and which is sadly probably a very low percentage of workers who attach to their work because they want to improve to the maintenance and improvement of the world. So on the basis of this, we can also talk about conditions of disaffection and disattachment from work. One is you have because of different policy changes, there is and also other economic trajectories towards transition, there is a degrowth of employment in toxic industries, in carbon-intensive industries. There is thereby redundancy of the skills of the workers in those industries, and a pressure on them to retrain for other roles. Then there is, to a lower extent, but there's less recognition for certain kinds of work, and you hear that in the oil industry, that it can be hard for them to hire people because a lot of the most skilled candidates do simply not want to take up the role. On the one hand, because they fear that they will be socially rejected by people they know, but also they might be aware, this is point 4, of the harmful character of this work. But of course, there are still attachments under these conditions. So this is an image from Ende Gelände, which is a direct action initiative that blocks German coal mines on a regular basis. In Germany, they're mining the most harmful kind of coal, lignite, and burning it in their industries. And here's a quote from an Ende Gelände activist I interviewed. I've spent hours and days talking to miners in West and East Germany. They fucking hate us with a passion and with good reason. The problem with them is not that they work batshit jobs, it's that their the energies and resources necessary to shift them from active opponents to at least undecideds may be far greater than that required to neutralize their opposition. So you have these workers who are actively opposing the phasing out of coal mining in Germany. And it's not just that they, sorry, it's not just that they have a power in doing that, but that they play a symbolic role for especially right and liberal parties to use them as an excuse to slow down transition. But let's look at some reactionary attachment in this kind of situation. One is that people might simply sink into unemployment, misery, and dependency on the welfare state or charity. And this creates conditions of a lot of resentment of them and by them, and scapegoating of the people who they think are to blame, which could be urban Greens are ruining our lives, or migrants, or whatever this happening, especially these German industrial, ex-industrial zones. Another is workers maintaining the pride in their skills, understandably, and refusing to retrain because they feel this is an imposition rather than an opportunity. Another is workers and communities maintaining pride in the harmful industries, whatever the rest of the world is saying, which is happening in many towns. You have a local identity that's strongly invested in the industry. And finally, in some cases, you have nihilistic and selfish carelessness about the consequences of what you're doing. And this is certainly like people who are working in much more well-paid job in the oil industry or in financing of the oil industry and so on. This simply seems to be a complete refusal to care. So disaffection is not enough. People being disaffected with the work or detached or made unemployed might just produce a kind of reactionary response. So there is also the question of transition, which is necessary, which includes different things. The transformation of production lines, as in the Lucas Aerospace plan, also the creation of new low or no carbon jobs in renewable energy, in ecological restoration and social reproduction, care, education, for instance. It also requires publicly funded retraining and a creative redeployment of skills. Like, let's say if you're a pipeline worker, you know plumbing, okay, maybe that can be used for something else, right? New jobs and volunteer activities as sources of meaning, pride, and respect. So I don't know, like if you take an old coal mine, how do you do ecological restoration of a landscape like this one? There might be certain ways of generating local pride in the community's capacity to do that. Finally, there has to be access to different forms of actually meaningful work, restorative and regenerative work, but also activities that are not wage labor based. So all these things hang together. Of course, the first point leads into the others. Okay, so just to not make it all about how do you replace one job with another, I also think we need to talk about working less. And here I'm going to read a little bit from a text about batshit jobs. A society beyond batshit work means less work and different kinds of work. A shift to different kinds of work would free millions from the physical and mental burdens of batshit work and redirect our efforts to some of the most meaningful and socially valuable activities you can imagine. Teaching and learning, care work, childcare, restorative farming, sustainable construction, reforestation, and much more. A short work week lowers the pressure for growth and for employment to be maintained even as aggregate throughput and labor requirements decline. Less work may mean less material consumption. And now I'm talking about not places that are already very poor, but places where we have reached a long time ago levels of sufficiency. Less work may mean less material consumption, but not necessarily a lower quality of life. Think of the joy of playing games, music and sports, cooking, sleeping, dancing and having sex, reading and learning, gardening and hanging out with your friends, lovers, neighbors and family. A life built up around care and conviviality would radically decrease the social demand for resource extraction and mass production. This would greatly weaken the power of capital to command our labor and to determine our present and increase the chance that we may someday exit the planetary disaster of the capitalist scene. Thank you very much for listening to this.
Thank you for your interesting and insightful presentation, Dr. Hansen. Dr. Hansen contrasts the duality of labor that Marx suggested that is concrete labor that produces use value and abstract labor that produce value. And he identifies several batshit jobs that need to be abolished or converted based on objective harm and subjective dissatisfaction and attachment by discussing some important case. Finally, through a very interesting diagram, he presented the cause of attachment to jobs, the cause of dissatisfaction, and the condition for the shift of batshit job. Okay.
Thank you. That's a very good summary.
Thank you. Now, anyone who has any question or discussion on this presentation, please raise your hand or leave your comments in the chat room.
May I speak?
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Kei Hara, and teaching Marxian economics in Tokyo. And today's your talk was really excellent, and I totally agree with your idea. And I actually recently came to think about how to problematize the concrete labor in context of COVID-19 crisis. You know, as you mentioned, after we experienced the COVID-19 crisis, the concept of essential work has become really important, also in Japan. So in that context, I started to thinking about how to problematize, first of all, the concrete labor in terms of Marxian political economy. And today I noticed that this concept or problem is really related to ecological crisis as well. I learned that issue from your presentation. Mm-hmm. And what I got interested in your presentation is the concept of Ikigai you mentioned. Mm-hmm. I would like to know how you come to use that concept. Where did you find that word in Japanese word? And I ask you this because the concept of Ikigai, the word Ikigai, is not a word in Japanese which used for an ecological problem in Japanese. So I wanted to ask you, why did you where did you find this word?
Thank you for that question, Kay. First of all, I'm really interested in what you're finding out in terms of problematizing essential work in terms of Marx's critique of political economy. I don't know if you've written anything about it yet, then I would love to know about it. And it's certainly something that I would like to do more. Of course, I go back very superficially to Marx's Capital, but I would like to do a deeper engagement with Marx. Like I said, the way I approached Marx was more value-informed theories. I'm used to all the questions of social form, abstract labor, and so on. So that's one thing. Where did I get the concept of Ikigai from? Basically from the circulation of self-help books that are self-help books. So books that suggest how people can improve their lives, basically. Written mainly in English, suggesting that they're drawing on Japanese wisdom. And I don't know if that's true. There's always a transformation that happens in the translation, but they use the word. And what I found with the diagram is that you can use it critically. If you understand what are the ultimate, what are the things that give meaning and value to people's activities, to their lives, you can use exactly the same to understand the absence of those things. And you can also use the same terms to understand the perversion of meaning when people become attached to activities that are harmful, but it gives meaning to their lives. Right? We know fascism does that as well. Sacrifice for the nation is very meaningful for those people who participate in that, but it's very harmful as well, right? So I think it could be used critically, and I'm interested in hearing, whether what people think about the way I used it. I hope that answered your question.
Oh yes. I understand how come you used that word, and I think the usage, your usage is really appropriate and correct. And
thank you.
And I'm sorry that I haven't written about the concrete labor in English yet, but I will try.
Okay.
Thanks.
Great. Please remember to send me an email when you have it. I should mention another thing, which is, I think as Marxists, one thing that is often underappreciated is the importance of the different kinds of attachments people have to work. And to say you're not just working because you need a wage. There are other aspects of the attachment to work, which is not just useful to understanding why people fight to maintain batshit jobs, but also useful to understand why some people sometimes refuse to participate in trade union action, for instance.
Thanks, I agree.
Okay, and Jeong,
I have a question.
Okay.
Yeah. So your talk is very interesting, actually, because you presented things that I didn't know anything about, frankly. But at the same time, I want to make two comments. First of all, I wonder whether you've heard of the concept of zero work. I can't remember right now the name of the author, the people who are behind it, but it seems it could be connected to what you're doing. But the larger question I have is coming out of Marx's Capital. I always understood abstract labor versus concrete labor as the capitalist desire to completely control the production process, which is, and therefore it's abstract, because the worker has no control over it. And they don't, actually the capitalists don't even give a shit about the work, they give a shit about the profits. Okay, but exactly. setting that aside, I wonder how we would ever, how, particularly you were quoting workers, I'm wondering how we can get to the point. It would be revolutionary what you're talking about. Just let's be blunt about it. Really revolutionary, even beyond Cuba or whatever Cuba. It's really revolutionary. So I'm wondering how you. Do you have any thought about how to get there? And maybe it's just too big a question, but I had to ask it.
No, that's the question, right?
Yeah.
That's and an important one we have to ask ourselves over and over again. So how to get there? I think it's I don't think there is any one strategy. I think there are many different venues we have to struggle on, because what we're talking about is bigger than revolution, in the sense that there's a reason why we name revolutions on with reference to the countries in which they happen. The Cuban Revolution, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, right? Those are geographically specific events. What we're talking about, what we need to see happening is a transformation of the energy base of the global economy, plus the functioning of the social metabolism of whatever kind of social reproduction with natural ecosystems. And that has to be a planetary process, right? It's bigger than revolution. Of course, revolutions might play a role in that process. I really think they will, but the process is greater than that, and in some cases, it can go on without revolution as well. So how to get there? What I think one is to get workers on the side of transition and transformation, rather than aligned with fossil capital against transition. Well, actually, that's not the first thing, but that's an important thing. So what that takes is producing disaffection with this kind of work and giving them other ways of alternative livelihoods, alternative sources of pride, alternative sources of meaning, right? And what that means is very contextual, right? It's very contextual. What depends on what other options are there in a specific mining town, for instance, or in a region that's dependent on the car industry. It depends on policies, but it depends on trade unions making demands for a restructuring of employment. Another thing is to get away, frankly, from the idea of trade union unity. As long as there are unions that are defending batshit jobs, trade union unity, the unity of the labor movement, is actively harmful because it blocks other unions from fighting for the necessary transition. So this sounds radical, right? But I've presented this argument to trade unionists in a service sector union in Brussels. It's an international service sector union, and there was very positive feedback. Like, the problem with service sector unions is that they say now there's a lot of feedback. No, maybe it's okay now. They have, what they've done on a European level is that they placed the question of industrial policy in relation to climate change with industrial unions, because, well, with service sector unions, we don't have to care about climate change and industrial policy. So they placed that policy area with the unions that are most actively fighting the necessary measures, which is a way of letting their members down, frankly, and the wider society, the families, the communities of the workers. And in climate terms, what some mining and industrial unions are doing must be described as a form of scabbing against the necessary action that trade unions have to take to protect their members and the wider communities. I'm not sure scabbing is the most precise term, because the action is not really being taken sufficiently, because other unions are waiting for the immediately affected unions, those that will lose jobs, to do the right thing. But then they're very unlikely to accept. They're very unlikely to accept a decline of employment within their sectors, because they're going to lose members, they're going to lose dues, and they're going to lose legitimacy if they support measures that entail loss of employment, right? So all this work on making people disaffected, or addressing the disaffections people already have, you know, the cognitive dissonance. I'm proud because I'm feeding my family, but I'm also feeling bad about the known consequences of this line of work. All that is necessary, but the most important thing is to create confidence in the rest of the labor movement, that we shouldn't wait for those unions to do the right thing. We should demand a transformation of the employment structure towards more education, more care work, more educational work, work in ecological restoration, and all these things that will create other kinds of employment, meaningful employment, socially and ecologically useful employment. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, I would say one thing to get back to the presentation I made in this trade union context. There were 50 trade unionists, and they did it in what is a typical way of doing it in that context, which was no time for questions. I don't know what people thought, but what I was told by the guy who invited me to speak was that the head of the trade union used the concept of batshit jobs positively at his closing address to the participants in the conference. So when you get a trade union boss and a service sector union embracing the idea of batshit jobs and the need to abolish them, I start to think it's maybe less utopian than it sounds. Maybe I'm too hopeful, but
okay, maybe let me just say one other thing, because your references seems to be more German, Austrian, UK. I mean, perhaps French. Okay, the United States, for example, is not so unionized as places you're talking about. But even forget about that. What about being a garment worker in Bangladesh? Or in India? I mean, how do we move this forward? What you're trying to accomplish is great, okay, but how do we move it forward for people who, who are stuck in these jobs? And their families have been stuck in a job. I mean, it's not just them; it's their their history that they. And okay, you get the idea, right?
Yeah, I think it depends very much on local specificities. I think, for instance, garment work in Bangladesh, as we know, is deadly, and a lot of these workers would be very happy to have other kinds of employment. The question is whether they can successfully make demands for that or not. I think there's one area in which there are where there are possibilities that don't have such a high threshold of success, which is when you're talking about migrant workers or workers whose family have a rural base, where there is the chance of rural movements demanding improvements of rural livelihoods, rekindling of basically of small towns and peasant agriculture, where there is that if there is finally investment into those regions going on, which there hasn't been in places like India, to my knowledge, then there is less reason for people to move from the countryside to the city to live in squalid conditions in factories that might kill you. I know this is not a traditional Marxist solution, but I do think that it's ecologically also a useful one, because what big cities are fed by industrial agriculture to a much larger extent than the countryside in the global south, which is fed by peasant agriculture, which is usually happening under agroecological conditions, simply out of necessity. People cannot afford to import nutrients and pesticides from somewhere else, so they have to have a local nutrient cycle in place in order not to exhaust the soil. Right? That is ecologically sustainable production. It's more. What I'm doing now is research into agriculture. So this is why I'm going this direction. It's peasant agriculture is more productive per hectare, but less productive per hour, which means more labor intensive, which means less profitable, but more productive in terms of the output. It can feed more people, but it also can employ more people. It needs to employ more people in order to do that. So actually having to have a process of ruralization is one way to shift the employment structure in places like India. I say as a non-expert in India, right? this is a hypothesis that I will defer to Indian comrades to make a judgment about this, of course. But it's a hypothesis that I think is interesting.
Thanks.
And Gyeongsang have a question in chat room. So
yes, so I'm going to read it out for everyone. The Lucas Plan, which is mentioned during the lecture, later influenced the Utopia project, an autonomous production technology development plan for Scandinavian design workers. I've read about another case in Germany, and I'm curious about whether there was a case stimulated by socially useful production concepts, what path it took afterwards, and how it was evaluated. I don't know. I come from Scandinavia. I grew up in Denmark, and I don't know about this. And I thank you for pointing it out to me. I would like to look into that further. This I've put on my to-do list. And I should say, since Paul, you said you guessed where my reference was from. Just to situate myself geographically. I grew up in Denmark. I studied in the UK. I lived in Spain for 6 years, and now I'm living in Austria, but working at a German university. So those are more or less the countries I'm familiar with, plus the United States, because it's impossible to not be forcibly familiarized with the United States just by opening your media. so I have some familiar with the United States as well, I suppose. But no authority, of course. Can I ask the Koreans a question? Because Korea was for a long time hyped as a leading country in sustainability, and it was a country that was an inspiration in different ways to other countries. I don't know if that hype is true or not, so I would be interested in your opinion about this. Is it true that Korea is doing a good job or not? And whether the job is good or not, I would like to hear what is happening in terms of shifting employment out of carbon-intensive industries. Does anyone know about this?
Sorry, in fact, I have no idea on this issue. So anyone who has information about this?
I see Owen is raising a hand.
Okay, Owen.
Hi, hello. You can see that I'm not a Korean, so I'm not going to exactly answer your question like that, but I do study Korea, and I was in Korea the last time, last year for 3 months. But it kind of actually, I'm going to relate my answer to something that I wanted to ask you about anyway, which is sort of, yeah, it was really, really good talk, fascinating, and it's given me a lot to think about. I suppose it's just like testing the limits of your concepts a bit, and like thinking about, obviously at one end you can have, it's quite easy to determine the either end of the kind of spectrum of value of jobs, right? As in like useful at one end, like caring and teaching and whatever, right? Lovely stuff. And then at the other end, something horrible like pulling hydrocarbons out of the ground and burning them. But obviously there's going to be a lot of stuff in the middle, which we might end up having debates about. Is this actually batshit labor or not, right? And it made me connected to something I was thinking when you asked the question about Korea. I mean, I would say to sustainability, Korea, like 100% not. It is a country that is built on a model of a construction state, which I think would be fair to say was pioneered by Japan in East Asia. which is that you just keep pouring concrete everywhere. Just keep pouring concrete. You build apartments, you build highways, you build bridges, you build railways, you build anything, or you embank every river that you can find with concrete, and just keep pouring concrete. And I mean, that doesn't sum up the entirety of the Korean economy, obviously, because it's an export-oriented economy and there's tons of other stuff going on. But domestically, to keep the domestic economy running, construction and infrastructure is really key. And I would say every time I go to Korea, I find more and more highways, more and more high-speed railway lines, more and more buildings everywhere. Essentially, Korea will more or less become a single conurbation linked by high-speed railways that will be like kind of the equivalent of a metro system linking the whole country together. It's almost getting that way already, right? People will commute from one end of the country to another. And that is not ecologically sustainable by any stretch of the imagination. On the other hand, we could say as Marxists, well, infrastructure is good. It has great use value and it's very useful for people. It has all kinds of positive benefits for people. So that's an area I think where you could have some debate about what is batshit and what is not batshit, right? It's crazy runaway infrastructure building like you have in South Korea, and I think now in China as well, is not good for the planet, right? And yet at the same time, up to a certain point, it is good for humans. So I don't know, that's an area where I would ask you, how do you find the edge of your kind of concept?
Yeah, that's the edge of the center, in a sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think this is where you're right, that this is where the most important both political and technical debates will happen, or should happen. I think it's another way to underline the importance of talking about concrete labor. Like what are the criteria of evaluation that we have in judging use value? Is it possible to maintain a distinction between ecological use value and social use value under conditions of ecosystem breakdown? Right? It might be, but within a very short time scale and within a very local horizon. But the kind of let's say as Marxists, we're trained to think about, it depends on the variety of Marxism we have, but we're used to thinking about organic totalities. Marx arguably analyzes capital as an organic totality, and some would say capitalist social formations as organic totalities, or the world economy as an organic totality. The thing about organisms is that they're not ecologists. Organisms need an environment. They need independent on an environment. And thinking about organic totalities is not thinking ecologically, right? Thinking about how organic totalities interface with their environment in terms of the metabolism and metabolic rift is also not ecological, because it's just thinking one relation within a wider ecology. I think we need to, when we think about utility, we need to think ecologically. So it means that what is good for humans on the evaluation criteria of a non-ecological evaluation criteria, for instance, building a massive high-speed rail network, if that is ecologically harmful, we're now in the period where that also results in social harm. And so you could say that it's no longer possible to, or it becomes less and less possible, and it's certainly wrong to maintain an environmentalist imaginary where you have humans and the environment over here or around there. You have to think everything is networked interdependencies. That's an ecological perspective. So yeah, that gives us different evaluation criteria of these construction projects. I think we need, we also need to think ecologically about society itself. So not just, when we think about society or capital as an organic totality, we tend to think about its growth, right? And clearly what you're talking about in Korea, what you're seeing in Korea is growth, right? Growth of the infrastructure, more precisely. But when we're thinking ecologically about social ecology, it's not just an organism that grows. We think about why is this constructed, right? What are the kinds of employment relations that are being sustained and expanded by enabling this kind of commuting? And is that kind of employment harmful to people or not? Is it draining? I would think it's pretty draining. I would think it undermines conditions of social solidarity to have your workplace be very far away from your community and other spaces of solidarity, associational life, and so on. It limits your capacity for participating in friendship and family life if you have to sit on the train for a long time. It limits the time you have for democratic participation by going to political meetings or whatever, right? So in terms of social ecology, this is growth, and it's growth of something that a good we recognize to be a good. It's nice to be able to move around, but it's socially harmful, as well as facilitating social harm, right? So I don't know. That's the kind of way I would start to think about this. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, 정성민 선생님.
Yes, thank you very much for the really interesting and talk. So, yes, as for your emphasis on the aspect of concrete labor, you mentioned that the existing Marxist economist is overemphasize the aspect of abstract labor, and while it's the marginalized the question of concrete labor. And you also introduced the concept of is a batshit jobs besides the bullshit jobs that it's David Graeber introduced. So but I think that the bullshit jobs or the best jobs, they are all related with the value production in capitalism. So I think that the most of the best jobs as well as the bullshit jobs will be abolished with the abolition of value production. That means the abolition of abstract labor. So I think so what is the utility of what's the of emphasizing that aspect, because most of them is in capitalism is a very is a result, and is closely related with the profit motive, very is exploitative, it's capitalist system. So, and you mentioned that bullshit jobs is kind of very meaningless, and the bad jobs is insane. So, and so the criteria of identifying the bullshit jobs or batch jobs is somewhat subjective or somewhat is ethical. So unlike Marx's distinction of productive and unproductive labor, is very objective. But so I'm not sure. So if we apply this kind of concept of concrete labor is exemplified by the bullshit jobs or the batch jobs to the empirical analysis and the designing the alternatives, we may face some difficulties. So I would like to know your opinions about the questions. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderfully critical set of questions. I think that's a great chance to clarify what I want to say, because I think we agree about the fundamentals of Marxist value theory. At least you didn't say anything that I disagree with on that point. I think there's a question of levels of abstraction. So I agree that on a high level of abstraction, certainly we have to analyze the vast majority of jobs in terms of their the production of value, right? And certainly if we abolish the value form, if we abolish wage labor, we abolish those jobs, and then we collectively decide what else to do, which is a question of you deciding on use values, deciding on the concrete labor that has to happen, right? For me, that makes a lot of sense. It's just it's on a very high level of abstraction. So the shift from the scenario in which batshit jobs exist and the scenario where it no longer does requires the abolition of value. That is not a process, that is an event, or that is a leap, right? That is the negation of a central characteristic of the global system, the world system in economic terms. So I would like to think about it in more processual terms, which means you can start to think about tactics, strategies, forms of organization, changes in how we think about the world, changes about how we're invested in work. So that's why I'm stressing these things. Another reason is to say that while I agree on a high level of abstraction, we analyze all work that happens under capitalism in relation to value production. I think it's true that empirically there are forms of work that are a drag on value production in some cases. I think it's true that David Graeber is kind of ironic as an anarchist, but he's saying with bullshit job, he's saying a lot of it is pointless for capital. It's just about domination. So what he's making a suggestion of is essentially that companies should streamline operations and get rid of people who are doing meaningless stuff, because that exists. Capitalist enterprises are not always fully aware of what work goes on inside them that's useful or not to the production of value. Also, you have state employment, or you have state subsidized employment that might be a drag on the production of value or indifferent to the production of value. Also, you have the potential of the continuity of batshit job under eco-modernist forms of socialism that don't operate with ecological criteria for deciding on what is useful and what is harmful, right? I think the case sometimes the case for the ecological destructiveness of state socialism is exaggerated. Sometimes the ecological initiatives of the Russians in the 1920s are underestimated. Nonetheless, I think there's no way to deny that different forms of socialism has operated in ways that have been indifferent to ecological destruction. Cuba has become an agroecological superpower, not because they wanted to, but because they lost access to artificial fertilizers with the end of the Soviet Union. And they had to transition to agroecology. They had to close the nutrient cycle on Cuba. And they did so successfully. It's very impressive. But that wasn't a socialist vision of how life should be that was imposed on them. And they made the best of it. And we can learn from it. But there are problems going on here that are not reducible to questions of value, profits, and so on. The other part of your critique had to do with whether it's a subjective definition or not. Bullshit jobs is both subjective and objective. It's subjective in the sense that people experience it as meaningless, but that experience is often to do with very objective relations. So if you're participating in a small production line, and you know that what you're doing is not at all contributing to neither the productivity of the work crew nor to the final product, to nothing, which happens empirically. It shouldn't happen from an abstract definition of capitalism, but it does. Then it's also objective, right? The same with batshit jobs. Batshit jobs is more, I would say, more objective than bullshit jobs, because the insanity is objective. People might subjectively think that what they're doing is harmless, but if it is harmless, that's a kind of structural insanity. People, without knowing it, are undermining the conditions of life, for instance, their local environment, in order to make a living. That's insane, but it's a structural insanity. It's not a subjective one. So those would be my answers. I hope it clarified things.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other question or comment? I can say that there has been something like movement to defend the batshit job in Korea. In South Korea, President Moon Jae-in, who stepped down from power a few weeks ago, has attempted to pursue a nuclear power phase-out policy midway through his tenure. Clearly, this was influenced by the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident in 2011 and Germany's policy. As a result, this policy in Korea failed. The cause, of course, lies in the inconsistent policies of the Moon Jae-in administration, but I would like to focus on another one of the causes, the resistance of nuclear power researchers, engineers, and workers. Although they did not organize large-scale demonstration, they expressed their dissent through various media. To me, this resistance seems to be an example of what you are talking about, something like unjustified attachment. And to transform this resistance into agreement to an ecological shift, I think that the first thing to do is to provide alternative jobs to nuclear power researchers, engineers, and workers. However, discussion about this industry transformation do not seem to be well discussed in Korea. In this sense, I think your presentation has a lot of meaning in Korea. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think it's time to finish our talk.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I've pasted the link to my original text on batshit jobs in case anyone is interested in reading it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I want to make one final comment, and that is we didn't talk about the military and weapons industry at all. That's okay.
That's my Eurocentrism. If I'd been in the United States, I would have been more aware of this. But obviously, also now with the war in Ukraine, you see how. Yeah, I agree. Good point.
Okay. Thank you for your great presentation, Dr. Hansen, and thank you all. In the next week, we have Hiroaki Matsusaka's talk, who is at Osaka University of Economics, on the topic Radical Movements of Afro-Asia on Wednesday, June 1st, 7 p.m. in Seoul time. I hope to see you all then. Thank you.
Thank you very much.